very, very nice to be here to be able to address some of these really very interesting points that have already started to pop up in the chat box. So please, we really do encourage you, if you do have any questions, if you'd like to participate. I know Suzanne and I could probably talk for a year, so
that's very true, that's very true.
As two Celts, we can probably keep on going and going and going for a very long time. So please do stop us and ask your questions as well, so that we can make sure that we address them. Again, there is no silly question, as has already been mentioned. So perhaps, Suzanne, we could kick off with a couple of the reflective questions.
Yes, absolutely. So the first one that we have, the first reflective question that we have is, how would you manage a student who dominates the discussion?
Yes, I think that we probably all had that student who dominates. Yeah, and I think they pop up at all ages. So yeah, this talk today is mainly aimed at teenagers, but I think, you know, we've all had that experience with a dominating person, student in the class. So for me, where in this type of context where the flow is so important, and trying to encourage as many people as possible to participate, what we don't want is a sort of mini dictatorship to arise, where it actually just becomes some sort of forum for a very domineering person to just impart their own vision of the world, which is exactly what we're trying to get away from. Because I can see it's already come up in the chat, but this point about the very first thing we have to try to do is to communicate to our students that their view, their world vision, is not necessarily a truth. It's just an opinion. And perhaps we also have to take a little dose of that ourselves as teachers, because this is extremely important. Because if we come into the classroom with an idea of, you know, this is a truth, this is exactly right, then we're going to steer the conversation, and it's not going to be a true critical thinking discussion. So that's a really important point. So to go back to the point about the domineering student, what I would do is I would use a timer. So I would use literally a timer. So for example, on the phone, or a little egg timer. Egg timers are really great. They're really fun. So you can just buy, you know, an old school traditional egg timer that, you know, we really used to use before we had mobile phones to time eggs. And you can give it to people. You can pass it around the class, okay, and say, right, you've got however long the egg timer is. I can't remember how long it actually takes to boil an egg.
I think it may be 3 minutes.
Oh, that's quite long, actually.
I feel like it's quite short. Is it 5 minutes? I don't know. Anyway, I think.
Tell us in the chat, how long does it take to boil an egg?
Yes.
So, 3 minutes.
Gabby says.
Brilliant. Okay, 3 minutes. Okay, 3 minutes is. That's actually, I said originally is quite long. It is a little bit. I always think, because IELTS, you know, I'm always thinking about IELTS. I'm very, very boring individual. That's what I think about a lot of the time. And because, you know, IELTS is 2 minutes, you know, you speak for 2 minutes uninterrupted. But, you know, if you are also teaching teenagers, you're also training them for exams that has a speaking component, as nearly all exams do. You could tie this in with how long they have to talk for uninterrupted in an exam context. So if it were IELTS, it's unlikely for teenagers, but that would be 2 minutes. If it was a Cambridge exam, it might be 3 to 4 minutes or 5 to 7 minutes for the collaborative task or whatever. Tie it in and say, oh, okay, so I know you guys are also training for FC, so let's do this for the same amount of time as you would talk for an FC, and time it like that. Or if you want to really gamify it, make it fun, use an old school egg timer, pass it around the class, and then everybody cannot speak for more than that time. And I think this kind of leads us into maybe the second question. Oh, hang on, Cindy has said 6 minutes. She obviously likes a hard-boiled egg.
Well, that's what I was thinking, because I think I quite like a soft-boiled egg. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about eggs before, so I don't know. Anyway, let's move on. The opposite, Nicky. What would you do with a student who's shy, reluctant to participate, doesn't really want to contribute? What would you do there?
So I think it's really, really important that we don't, if somebody is not very confident to speak, there's obviously always an underlying reason why.
Sure.
What we don't want to do, especially with teenagers, is give them some kind of trauma, which will only get worse and worse and worse if we keep on coming in with, you know, the invisible whip and sort of, no, you must speak, and now there's an egg timer and you must speak for the whole duration of the egg timer. So about the egg timer or any kind of timer, in my mind, that's more for the domineering student. It's not necessarily to force a less confident student to speak, because they have to build up that confidence gradually and naturally through seeing the fruits of their own positive experience. So the more positive their experience is, the more they will feel inclined to speak, and then that will just grow and grow and grow and grow. So this brings me on to what I mentioned with regards to synchronous and asynchronous learning. So even though you might be face-to-face, you still have access to all these asynchronous platforms that I think we've all become more familiar with. We were all a lot more comfortable with tech, any tech, just tech in general, than we were, you know, a year, 18 months ago. So use something like Edmodo or voice recordings. There's also, I've talked about in other webinars, but something called Voice Spice, where you can make a little recording for free. It's super easy. Then you can just email it. So if somebody is really reluctant to speak in class, they might feel more confident to do it if they've got some chance to practice it. They can record it again and again and again. And then if you have a group, for example, Edmodo page, which works, as I said, a lot like Facebook, or a group Padlet page, or some sort of asynchronous way of storing things, then they can upload it there, and the whole of the class can still listen to it, but they don't necessarily experience that pressure of needing to speak in class. And then, you know, as a piece of homework, you could set the task of people being forced to comment positively, of course, on each other's posts. And then in the next lesson, they might come in and feel, oh, I can actually say this aloud now in front of all of my classmates. So yeah, I would try to make the most of asynchronous resources there for that.
Okay.
So yeah, what are your thoughts, Suzanne, on the reluctant speaker?
Yes, it is difficult. It's difficult, and I think that you know, when you have your own class and when you've been teaching them for a while, you know who's reluctant, and you know, as you say, you may or may not know the reasons behind that, but there are always going to be reasons behind that. And the last thing that we want to do is, you know, get said whip or said egg timer, whatever, out there, and actually sort of make them even shyer or even less likely to contribute. So yeah, no, absolutely, using tech, as you say, is a brilliant way around things. But also I think, you know, you were talking about positive collaboration, and I've found certainly in my through my experience that, you know, when you do create this positive collaboration and you do have the respectful environment, the safe environment that isn't controversial, you know, you're not courting controversy or anything like it, the reluctant students do tend to move towards being more proactive, more interactive, and I think a lot of that comes down to the environment that they're now used to. I don't know if you've found that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think the point you made at the beginning, where you know, we get to know our students, is great if we have them for a long time. But as you and I know, Suzanne, when we're running these sorts of like short summer schools, it can be really, really tricky, you know, in a relatively short space of time. And I think it also can be really frustrating for the type of student who just doesn't like speaking, or who's not very confident, or who just prefers other ways to express themselves. And what we found last summer when we ran an online version of a summer course, you know, with very short, having people, you know, a large number of students for a very short period of time, is some of the people who are quite reluctant to talk in class, they made these amazing like memes and videos, because they had all these like skills, you know, that they wouldn't be able to show necessarily in a face-to-face environment, because they were more techie, and so, but then they were able, and techie people sometimes, making a huge generalization here, but maybe are not so, you know, I'm a talker, I'll talk all day, you know, but I'm not really up for video editing. It's just not my bag. But I think perhaps the opposite is also true. Other people who are really like making little memes and things and videos, they don't necessarily want to be talking all day. So we saw these really great things, and at the end everybody got to participate, and that's what really made me realize how valuable some of these things some of these things can be. But it is really tricky. I think when you have people for a long time, then you can really get under their skin and sort of really work out how to bring the best out of them. And I mean, critical thinking doesn't have to be spoken. It can come through in other ways as well. It can come through people doing a really great piece of writing, or even a poem, or all sorts of other things that you can. What we're trying to do here is get young people thinking critically. It's a great vehicle for also introducing speaking skills in the EFL world, but I don't think it has to only be about speaking.
Sure, absolutely. We've got a very good question in the chat.
Oh,
can I read it out to you?
Yeah, please.
So it's from Gabby, and it says, Nicky, can you say again how you understand critical thinking in a teenage class? What exactly does it? What does it involve, and how do we teach it, or how can we teach it? And then she also says, sorry if I'm asking you to repeat what you already said. So
I'm just looking back through the chat again. So Nicky, can you say, how you understand critical thinking in a teenage class? What exactly do they involve, and how do we teach it? Oof, that's the whole workshop.
So just in a couple of minutes.
Okay, so critical thinking in a nutshell, because as I mentioned at the start of the workshop, this is a huge topic. I mean, people can write dissertations and essays and do PhDs on it, etc. But for me, getting people to think critically is the idea that, we are opening our minds, we're accepting the fact that we may not necessarily always be right, and we're looking at a set of ideas, and then we're going to draw our own conclusions based on evidence and not based on sort of emotional beliefs. Okay, so that in a nutshell is critical thinking. Okay, in a teenage class, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get some of those core ideas, starting the process with our teenage learners, because as I mentioned in the workshop, I see it more from when I see it more at an adult end, so the end of sort of exams with adults, where there's a huge element of critical thinking. Very often, many students aren't able to manage the questions because they don't have basic critical thinking skills. They're not able to take a question and very quickly throw some ideas around in their head and come to an answer. And for writing essays and for all parts of the exams. But what I'm trying to say here is that we can start to introduce these skills, I think, even as young as teenagers, with some topics that are not controversial. This is really, really important. Yeah, so nothing political, nothing that, where we're going to provide a breeding ground for people to bring in these very controversial. They say, well, my dad says it's like that, and so that's the way it is. Because sometimes when you're 13 or 14, you're just basically a sponge for your own parents or your own family or your own immediate environment's beliefs. And then you just come in and for you, they are truths because that's what you've been brought up with up to that point. And what we're saying is, come with your truths, we'll unpick them. We'll look at other people's visions and other people's truths, and then we'll start to see if we can think, well, is that actually true? And am I actually right? And do I have a different opinion? And that is critical thinking. But when it comes to teenagers, and sorry, if you can start to develop that skill quite early on, it's not just about passing exams. It's about, I think I gave the example there, your plumber gives you, you get 5 quotes from 5 different plumbers. That's critical thinking, deciding which one is the best to go with based on a series of pieces of evidence that you have in front of you. So yeah, with teenagers, it's trying to start to get some of those ideas inculcated, but at the same time, making sure you don't choose anything controversial. And I kind of touched on it in the presentation, but for me, one of the most controversial topics is food, especially with multinational groups, because I kind of made a bit of a joke about it. But, you know, ask a group of people from Middle Eastern countries where hummus or falafel comes from, and you could end up with something bordering on something very unpleasant, you know. Ask a Spanish person, an Italian person who has the best tomato sauce. It sounds kind of funny, but, you know, I've seen it come to like really quite serious moments. So try to do things where there's like a problem solving aspect, you know. The food in your school canteen, for example, that's a really nice one. Rubbish or litter, or identify a problem in your local area that you would like to solve. These kinds of things that are much more general and also interesting, because if you do have a multinational class, and you might sort of see different people from different. I did that exact exercise, a problem in a local area, and we had somebody from Russia who made a brilliant little video, a teenager from Russia, all about the fact that the grass was too long next to the sides of the road, that the bush and the grass was going really long, and there were all these weeds, and he went into the weeds and he was showing the different types of grass, and he was going to contact the council and suggest that they cut it more often because it was starting to become dangerous for drivers on the road. And really? It's just, yeah, you see, it's just great. And there's nothing controversial about that, because really, who cares about grass in that, you know, you're not going to get a French person saying, no, the grass is longer in my city, you know. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Gabby, does that answer the question? I hope so.
I think that the next part of the question, she was asking, how do we teach it? What would be your approach? Let's think, for example, you've spoken about a multilingual class. What if you've got a monolingual class? Everybody comes from the same part of the world. Let's think of something really like, well, I spent a long time in Naples, in Italy, and pizza. Let's talk about pizza. If we're talking about food, we might as well talk about pizza. If you've got a class of students who all have the same background, the same culture, and you want to introduce critical thinking, and pizza comes up, for example, just as an example, how would you work with that?
I would turn it into a game, like a silly game, a bit like where you do something like have a debate about whether there's such a thing as Father Christmas. Yeah, so it's something so silly and so like off the wall. Obviously, we all know there's no Father Christmas. Sorry if there's anyone here who still thinks there is. Oh,
can't believe it. Nicky.
Sorry. It must have been just fresh in my mind, because my 10-year-old niece told me yesterday or the day before that she knew there wasn't a Father Christmas. I felt quite sad. So maybe that's just what's coming to my head. But I remember when I was at uni, I was on the debating team, which probably doesn't surprise anyone given how much I talk. So we used to have these like practice debates where they would come up with these ridiculous ideas like, Father Christmas does not exist, debate. And one side would have to debate that Father Christmas does exist, even though it's, just to practice the skills of debating. So say you're in Naples and, you can take it as a given that everybody likes pizza. Why not do like the best topping, for example, So you have like two teams, for example, and one team has to come up with all of the reasons why straightforward margarita is the best topping, and the other team has to come up with all of the reasons why it's totally acceptable to have these wild new toppings like Thai curry and these kinds of things, and debate that. That could be really, really fun. And really it's there's no real consequence there, but it's just practicing these skills of having to think like, well, is cheese and tomato the best? Why? And then you're kind of touching on elements of like tradition and culture as well, because if the other side has to defend the fact that no, it's fine to evolve pizza and put chicken curry on top of it and this kind of thing in a very non-political soft way, you're actually starting to have a debate about whether or not countries or society should stay super traditional or start to become a bit more open. So yeah, that's what I would do if I was in Naples. First, I'd go and eat some pizza. That's what I would do.
Absolutely, yes. I've got a big long list of recommendations for you.
Oh gosh, yes, that sounds great.
Just in, Nicky.
Okay.
Are we teaching critical thinking or simply asking students to speak and use English?
Yes, I think it's both. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I think critical thinking is a very important life skill. And if we see ourselves as educators, not just as English language teachers, then this is just a really important, in my opinion. Of course, I may be wrong, because that's one of the first things. I might not even be right. I don't want to get, like I said, too philosophical about it, because it's something that's so, this is something that we can get very deep about. But here, what we're doing is we're using this topic of critical thinking to also practice English language skills. I don't think, as I said earlier, they necessarily have to be spoken. I think you could ask people to produce it in a written format, in all sorts of, as a poem, in all sorts of different ways. I mean, we're all very imaginative teachers, so we can come up with the different ways. But I think it's a bit of both. What do you think, Suzanne, in your experience with the teenagers?
Absolutely. I think it's definitely a bit of both. And the beauty of being an English language teacher and an educator is that everything we do is through use of the English language. So whether it's critical thinking or whether it's explaining how to make a coffee, whatever it might be, it's always about, so it's so intertwined. I don't think it can be picked apart, to be honest, which I think personally is great. So we have another question, Justin, hot off the press, Nicky. Would you agree that all teachers teach critical thinking, if not overtly, even if not overtly?
No. Sorry, how controversial am I allowed to be here now?
Very, I would think. As long as it's not about pizza, you're fine.
I mean, okay, so I teach English as a foreign language in the UK, in Cardiff, in a sort of a generally British education system. Now, I mean, I know from my various travels and, my various stints abroad, that in a lot of places, there is no emphasis on critical thinking at all. It's learn these 70 verbs, or, present simple swallow, present continuous swallow, present perfect swallow, with very, 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 very little emphasis on even production of language, let alone taking it to the next step, which would be like, okay, not only produce it, but also we're going to try to introduce elements of real critical thinking and do really challenging projects, and have more like sort of challenging lesson aims and objectives. So yeah, no, I don't think that all teachers teach critical thinking. And I think that's what hopefully all of the people that are watching and will watch this webinar is what I think I would like to do here, is to sort of start to give some suggestions of like, come on, we can do this, we can do both. We can get, it doesn't have to be, learn 70 verbs or whatever. And tick, okay, yeah, I've paid my money for my English Academy, and Michele has come home and said that he knows the present perfect. Great. And actually we know that Michele hasn't got a blind clue about what the present perfect is, and certainly could not produce it. So yeah, so I think we're kind of quite far away from there if I think about in the way English language is taught all over the world. And then of course we have to also take into account the fact that there are many parts of the world where critical thinking is not only not part of life, it may be actively discouraged through law or through, so these are, again, whole kind of other topics where people are actively discouraged not to think for themselves, or just to learn through memorization. And, so this is, as I said at the very beginning, this is a topic that has kind of tentacles that reach very, very, very far.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Do you think then, thinking about these sort of methodologies of, learn 70 verbs for next Thursday, for example, is the first real audience of critical thinking other teachers?
You mean sort of teachers with other teachers?
Yeah. Would we be challenging each other a little bit more than we do you think?
That's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, if I see this kind of this way of doing it, you know, in a lot of other countries, and even here, you know, I'm not trying to say it doesn't happen here, but because obviously here people tend to come to the UK because they want the immersive experience of coming to the UK, and they come because they want to learn to speak how people really speak, and usually because they want to speak. So people who maybe sign up for, say, language academies, or who just have to go through the school system in their own countries, they don't really have a lot of choice. So they're not necessarily seeking out natural English, or really being able to speak or critically think, or any of these sorts of things. So yeah, perhaps the first step is for teachers to start to learn between themselves how to critically think, and then passing that on to the teenagers. Yeah. Yeah. I think Gabby's got one here.
Yeah, another question just in, again, hot off the press. Is there a way to actually assess critical thinking in a teenage class, and then in brackets, general English, and should we even assess it?
I wouldn't assess the thinking. I would assess the language. But I think if we start to try to assess how critically we think they thought, so you weren't critical enough, yeah, with your critical thinking.
Yeah,
I think that's a good question. Yeah, you haven't. You're not deep enough. Get deeper. I think that could be quite problematic, because that might undermine the whole basis of the fact that, you know, one of the core pillars of it is that you have to come at it with the belief that you're not right. So yeah, but the language, oh gosh, definitely you can assess the language. You know, it's great. I think the thing about the critical thinking element is, I mean, we've sort of touched on it, is that it's just embedded. It's quite hidden. You know, we don't necessarily have to. And I think this is actually the last reflective question about whether it should be a whole lesson or a part of a lesson. Definitely not a whole lesson. I don't think we have to have a point where, like, oh, it's 3 p.m. I am going to critically think now. Also, because, as I mentioned in the presentation, I don't know about you guys, but I often have what I would consider to be my better thoughts when I'm not even actually thinking about what I'm thinking about it on purpose, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Which is also why I think there's such a great role for asynchronous platforms, because then if there is like, as I said, a Padlet or something very easy that, or even just Google Keep or anything like that, or, that you can use, you just say, oh gosh, yeah, of course. You just tap it down in your phone, or, you know, and upload it to a site or something like that at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, you know, if that's the time when it comes to you. And then just use the part of the lesson more as a kind of a forum for bringing all of those things together.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about, you know, we want to encourage critical thinking, we want our students at that point, do we also want our students to better question, do we expect our students to know and think that we have critical thinking as well? You know, is it a two-way process, do you think?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so you mean, do we expect them to come back at us critically, to actually sort of involve us? I mean, that would be great. I mean, that would be a real sort of leveler for the students and the teachers. And I think maybe with the right group of students in the right kind of teaching and learning environment, that could work. I mean, as I said, I sort of see the job of the teacher more as a sort of an umpire. Yep. Where really what we really want to do is get them producing as much as possible, and we're just kind of facilitating, you know, making sure that no rules are being broken, making sure that nobody's uncomfortable, making sure that nobody's domineering or these kinds of things, rather than necessarily be an active participant. But I suppose if the teenagers if you had no classroom management issues and the teenager was really much older, yeah, Hetty's smiling, she's like, yes. And I suppose it also depends on the size of the class, because if you have like a sort of a micro group, like 4, 5, 6 students or whatever, then, yeah, you got on very well, and there were no classroom management issues, and everything, you'd already had a few other kind of topic-based lessons where there's critical thinking embedded, then perhaps the teacher could become a more like a participant. But I think if we're sort of teaching 30 people, 30 teenagers in a classroom, and then the headmaster walks past, the head teacher walks past, and you're just there. So I'm critically thinking with my students.
Absolutely.
Where they expect you to be standing at the front, that could be a little bit difficult. But definitely in teams, and sort of going around and facilitating, refereeing, maybe making a member of each of the. So say, for example, you did have a very large group. Nobody's asked a question about that, but that's something that was kind of on my mind. Gabby's just raised her hand. Gabby,
Nicky.
Hi, Gabby.
Hi. Sorry,
Hi.
I just had to. I have to ask you this question. It may be a silly question. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi.
It may be a silly question, but this critical thinking topic is really bothering me. Okay, as you can probably see. So my question is, let's say when because you observe teachers, right? Okay, a busy summer camp. Yeah, Suzanne, same goes for you. Yeah. So you have hundreds of teachers, and then you observe teachers teaching teenagers, and then you have this understanding of critical thinking as part of the curriculum, right? So we have to kind of push students to use critical thinking, etc., etc. So when you observe your teachers, do you actually watch for how teachers help students develop critical thinking? And then if you do, how do you provide feedback? How do you actually talk to your teachers during the feedback session, and how do you tell them that they were not using enough or not making their students use enough critical thinking? See, my point again is, because so many people talk about critical thinking, okay, but then when it actually comes to the very practicality of it in the classroom, nobody ever knows how to do it. I mean, I know you did say, but then I'm just trying, like, when I watch teachers, I observe teachers, and how do I know that the teacher is making students use their critical thinking skills? And if the teacher is not doing this, then do I address it in the feedback session, post-observation feedback session? I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Yeah, I think it's okay. So so critical. I think the point, the core sort of point here is that critical thinking is a little bit. It's not easy to sort of put a tick in the box, right? Like, did they demonstrate good handwriting on the board and identified all parts of speech in a sentence? Yes, they did. Tick the box. Yeah. So I think that there's a lot first of all, in terms of the types of courses that we run. So when we have run these teenage courses that have this kind of critical thinking element in them, it's embedded throughout the entire curriculum, throughout the entire syllabus. All of the more traditional parts of a lesson, so say the grammar elements or other sort of reading, listening, it was very, very, very secondary to the topics. It was a topic-based curriculum, and it was just a constant critical thinking with a very specific outcome, which was in the case of one of the courses we ran last year was for the participants to deliver a project where we were only assessing the language. We weren't assessing the critical thinking skills. But throughout the course, they had to do other things in order to pass the course. So, for example, they had to leave at least one comment on one other student's Edmodo. So they had to upload at least one thing. to Edmodo, and they had to leave at least one comment, one positive comment, making a suggestion for how the person who posted that thing could, for example, fix the problem that they were posting about. So they had to do these things in order to be able to pass the course. So there was like an element of sort of continuous assessments, but based around critical thinking. In terms of the teachers, we chose the teachers based on their own attitudes to how well we thought they would be able to develop critical thinking skills with the students themselves. So, and we also asked them to do trial lessons, and where we watched to see how, what their kind of relationships were with the students, how they were, what the interaction patterns were like, and if they were really trying to develop these sorts of skills within the students themselves. So, and then in terms of the observations, yes, it was picked up on by the academic manager of, okay, yeah, you could have done this, this, this in order to have kept the debate going better in this, this, this aspect. Have you moderated all the posts for your students, etc. So there were some specific things that were actually looked out for within the teachers themselves. But I totally understand what you're saying. And I think that, as Suzanne and I think, talked about earlier, I think this idea of critical thinking in the classroom is sort of in its infancy, especially where there may be a curriculum which is still very, very traditional. I mean, we are in a privileged position that we were able to write our own curriculum, our own scheme of work from scratch, with nobody else really, obviously to British Council standards, but with nobody else above us really sort of saying, yes, you should do this, you shouldn't do this. Obviously, if you're in a secondary school or in a very established language academy, you might not have that kind of freedom. But I would say, you know, just try to pepper it in and make a space on the lesson plans and on the teacher observation forms to sort of say, right, was an element of critical thinking introduced into the lesson plan? Was it observed? How was critical thinking observed within the students? If so, yes, why or why not?
Yeah, you see, the reason why I'm asking is actually because some time ago, when critical thinking got really popular, you know, it was one of those buzzwords, like everybody was talking about critical thinking, and quite perhaps uncritically, okay, I wanted to follow the fashion. And I remember that I kind of wanted to start with the teachers thinking critically first, and I was trying to get my teachers to actually kind of name the critical thinking that they wanted to apply, or say not teach, but wanted their students to use in a given lesson. And I wanted the teachers to actually spell it out on the lesson plan. So there was like a special, you know, place for teachers to name the critical thinking that students would be using when performing a particular task. And it may have been a crazy idea because, well, it was a crazy idea because it didn't work. And it didn't work because teachers were not able to actually name the critical thinking skills. So you see, and that's why I asked earlier that perhaps we are not qualified to teach it, because if we are not able to name the individual critical thinking skills, how can we teach those to our students, and how can we encourage students to use them if we don't know what they are? So, yeah, sorry, this was long-winded again. It's just that I feel very strongly about critical thinking skills, and
I think that, okay, to go not to go back too much to eggs, but I think we have to not over egg our cake here. So we're not sort of trying to invent the wheel. The main thing is that we want to try to introduce some element of critical thinking into the English language classroom. At the end of the day, this is principally the English language classroom. So I don't want to get away from that. You know, we're using critical thinking as a tool to get people using the English language, you know, producing the English language. This is the key. the point that I think there are some key elements of critical thinking that I specifically, named at the beginning of the presentation that I think we could take as a sort of a basic guide to what critical thinking is. But I think the thing about critical thinking, and the reason why it's a bit controversial, is it's very intangible. So if I go back to the example of, that was recently in Spain and asked a teenager, what did you do in the language academy? I learned 70 verbs, yeah? And the mum said to me, oh, that's great, isn't it? I pay all this money and my daughter learned 70 verbs in one lesson. I said, no, that's useless. Sorry, again, to be controversial, because I know that girl doesn't even feel comfortable answering any more than hello, how are you? So what difference does it make if she can recite 70 verbs? Yeah. So, and why do parents think that's useful, a useful use of their money? It's because it's tangible. It's because their daughter comes home and says, Mum, I learned 70 verbs in English. They go, great, my money's being well spent, tick in the box. If they come home from language academy and their mum and dad and parents say, oh, what did you say? Well, we thought about the environment. It's not, there may be a lot going on inside their brains, which they're getting all these great life skills, that's going to be super useful in the future. And who knows, they may become an eco warrior and et cetera, But the point is, it's not easy to evidence it, which, Gabby, is exactly what you're touching on when it comes to the teachers themselves. But does that mean that we should turn our backs on it completely? I don't think so. I think that there's elements of it that we can use as a vehicle to get our students producing language.
And Nicky, don't get me wrong, because I'm all for using critical thinking skills in the classroom. It's not like, I will be the first one advocating for this, but the only issue that I take with it is the fact that I feel that we are not quite prepared. So what I would be advocating for is actually more courses for teachers to develop their own critical thinking and to reflect on or to understand the different critical thinking skills, so that they can then use this in the classroom when teaching teenagers in particular. So I'm not against not teaching, because again, we don't teach critical thinking. We help students use their critical thinking skills, and we help them identify those skills. And once identified, they can use them, right? So the problem is with the teachers, including myself. I'm not an expert here, so I wouldn't be able to name all the critical thinking skills. I'm just saying that we may not be qualified to do it, and I'm advocating for more courses on how to understand critical thinking skills, how to teach them, and the importance of using it in the classroom.
I think there's a couple of questions that have come up from Maria in the chat as well, and I think I think the two points about the last one being about the parents of people who think that you need to come home and have 70 verbs and tick in the box. This is exactly the point. Yes, we're talking in order to get to a time and space where this kind of teaching disappears in favor of a far less tangible, but probably more fruitful type of learning that's based on production. This is very, very far away. And in a sense, I don't really blame people that they want to have some kind of tangible evidence. We ran a course, another online course recently, I believe it was with teenagers in Russia, and everything was done through Padlet. And we got to the end of the course and the teachers said, where's the material? And we said, well, it was a speaking course. It was a speaking and communication course, and they did a speaking project, and there's all of there's information and links and everything else on Padlet, and the teacher said, but where's the material? And we had to go back and put together material for a course that we'd already, because to them, there wasn't a tangible outcome. they had delivered, and I, and so I'm talking about, it would be a shift, a huge shift that we're like super, super far away from. And anyway, I think at the end of the day, the people who really, really want to learn English because they want to learn it fluently, they want to learn natural English, at some point they will go and immerse themselves in the culture. To be able to pick up the language to that extent. But it's quite, and as I said, I don't really blame people for wanting something a bit more tangible, because they sort of feel like, well, I'm sending my child to school every day, where's the evidence? I'm paying my money for the academy, where's the evidence? So that's not an easy circle to square to circle, and far too big for today's chat, but it's a hurdle. It's a hurdle. And I think the other question, how close is critical thinking to common sense? I don't know, Suzanne, what do you think about that?
I don't know. It's that's the sort of question that kind of ties your mind up a little bit.
Yeah, I know. I've read it about 6 times now, and I'm thinking I'll keep that one for last, because
Absolutely. Where do you start? Because the thing that's like, define common sense. My common sense is going to be different to someone else's common sense. That is going. My husband, for example, is completely different common sense to me. So that's one place to start. Yeah, I think my mind is in a knot with that. I've gone round in a circle about 4 times. What do you think?
Well, I would, yeah. My initial reaction is exactly the same as yours, Suzanne. There's what is common sense and what is critical thinking, because we're talking about 2 things. If we go back to for me, what is one of the core principles of critical thinking, which is that you have to assume you're not right. If you assume you're right, as in my common sense is right.
Yeah.
So the whole thing it's one of those questions that looks easy, but it's not simple.
Absolutely.
If I may,
yeah, please.
Before we go, okay.
yeah,
Can
definitely.
it be that common sense is simply something that you never question? It just is there, and critical thinking is something you really should be reflecting on. So, like, critical thinking skills should be named, and you should be reflecting on them. And they are more academic. Common sense is just something that you never even question. Maybe.
I'm happy to go with that. Thank you, Gabby. Yes. I keep going back to what Suzanne said. One person's version of common sense is very, very different to another person's version of what is common sense.
Which almost in a way is critical thinking in a nutshell, isn't it? Almost. It's like, your common sense isn't always right.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So, I mean, it depends on what level. Should you walk into the road when it's the red man, not the green man?
Yeah.
No. I think most people would agree that, that's common sense. You don't do that because you could come to harm. You don't need to stand there and philosophically look at the red and the green person and wonder, and should I or not? Or but yeah, I think it's a very, very good question and a very tricky one. Maria, what do you think? What if you were daltonic? Oh gosh. Okay. Oh, hang on, Maria's raised her hand.
Yeah. It's just that I'm really enjoying this discussion, because there is so much food for thought. And of course, it's just when it comes to critical thinking, I mean, what you said, I think it's embedded in the entire, when we're talking about English lessons, but is this critical thinking is embedded in everyday's life and everything we do. And that's why I just said, well, it hasn't got much to do with common sense. But again, when you've said, well, common sense, well, again, I mean, but for somebody this is a common sense, like, anyway, an example I'll give you that's happened to me recently. An old lady friend of mine, she said, well, I always go this way because that's what everybody does. And I said, well, but there is another possibility of going the other way. Oh, yeah, but that's what everybody does. So again, I mean, what is the critical thinking? What is the trying to? It's just like, I find it is a very, very tricky issue, and critical thinking. I love it. but perhaps I associate it to the fact of a more philosophical training. You know, if you've done philosophy, I mean, critical thinking is there all the time, but again, perhaps it's too complicated and is perhaps a topic that we could do with more sessions.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks for raising your hand there. It was lovely to hear your voice because I've seen you quite a few times. In other webinars as well. So it's really nice to hear from you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Most enjoyable.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you.